So in this segment, we're going to map these 4 basic functions onto the brain, onto the central nervous system, I should say. So if we come over here, what we see is what you would find if you opened up the skull and you were looking at the brain from the side. So this is the back, this is the front, and this entire, everything that you see here, all of this is the forebrain. It's all that you can see from the outside, from the side. Back here, this is part of the brainstem. It's actually a part that's called the cerebellum. So this is part of the brainstem, and then if we followed this further back, we would get to the spinal cord. Now, the separation between the brain and the spinal cord is that the brain is contained in the skull, and then there's an opening in the skull called the foramen magnum where the brain actually attaches to the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is contained in a different set of bones called the vertebral column. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take a view from the middle of the brain, and we're going to look at the medial surface. We're going to cut like this and look into the middle of the brain. So here we have a brain, and once again we see this appearance that we saw from the outside. This is part of the forebrain, and in fact the forebrain goes all the way through here. All of this is forebrain. This back here is brainstem, and it's split into a hindbrain, which is all of this, and a midbrain. We'll look at that more later. But this entire bit, the midbrain and the hindbrain, is the brainstem, and back here is the spinal cord. So where do these 4 different functions, where do they map onto? Well, let's start with voluntary movements. Now, voluntary movements means moving your skeletal muscle, your voluntary muscles. And there's only one neuron type that leaves the central nervous system and goes directly to muscles. And that's the motor neuron. And there aren't very many of them. There's under 100,000 out of 200 billion neurons in the central nervous system. So they're rare. They're a very special type of neuron. If they die, you can no longer move that muscle. Now, where are the motor neurons? The motor neurons are contained either in the brainstem or in the spinal cord, but there are no motor neurons in the forebrain. So the motor neurons in the brainstem move the face, move the mouth, move the larynx, and are responsible for speech and swallowing, facial expressions, things like that. The motor neurons in the spinal cord are responsible for doing all this stuff. All of our arms, our legs, our trunk, all of our movement that we do with our body happens through the spinal cord. Perception, remember that perception is the conscious perception of sensory inputs, the conscious appreciation of sensory inputs. And that depends entirely on the forebrain. In fact, the appreciation of sensory inputs, the conscious appreciation of sensory inputs depends on the cerebral cortex. All of this, all of these hills and valleys, this entire surface is all cerebral cortex. This is what is required for perception. If you don't make it up to cerebral cortex, there is no perception that can occur. Okay, so the information can come in through the spinal cord, through the brainstem, even through the forebrain, but it has to make it to this area, to this cerebral cortex, this outer mantle. Homeostasis is a very distributed process. It depends on the forebrain, it depends on the brainstem, and it depends on the spinal cord. So up in forebrain, the contribution to homeostasis is hormonal. In brainstem, the contribution is varied. It's both through autonomic changes, automatic changes that we're not conscious of and we don't consciously control, as well as consciously made movements. And the same is true for the spinal cord. And finally, higher abstract functions depend entirely on the forebrain. That's all, they all take place. It's like cogwheels just running around in the forebrain. So even if you didn't have the brainstem and the spinal cord, if you could keep this forebrain alive, the thoughts and emotions could turn their wheels. So higher abstract functions are a outcome of this same cerebral cortex that is required for perception. And in fact, perception is one of the higher abstract functions that we have, but we're also going to look at it separately. Okay, so what we have is different capacities in the different areas. The forebrain is critical to higher function, language, memory, emotion, thought, all of that. Brainstem and spinal cord are a little bit of a mix and match where they're very good doers. They can move, and they are pathways for ascending, for incoming sensory input, as well as for outgoing homeostatic adjustments.